Hello and welcome to the third of the videos about how to get yourself starting drawing. So let's have a quick recap first. In the first lesson we talked about mark making and the different types of mark making that you can achieve with a simple pencil, preferably a traditional style pencil and a rubber. And I also suggested it might be best to sharpen your pencil using a knife because it gives you a longer lead or piece of graphite at the end there. So there are 3 stages of drawing, and they are drawing a shape, that's the first stage, adding a shading, that's the second stage, that's what we're looking at today, and then the third stage is making the texture. So we're looking at shading today. I did ask you to think about looking at nice, simple, natural shapes in the last lesson when you're drawing. So I've done my page of drawings here, which I referred to last week, and then there's the drawings that I started last week on the video. So I'm going to be working on these ones today, and that's because I have used the photocopy or the printout from the internet as the thing that I'm using as my guide for the shading. It is much easier if you're starting out to use something that's black and white because the gradient variation, the tonal variation is already worked out for you. Whereas if you've got something in colour, then you have to sort out in your brain the difference between the shaded and the colour and the tone and everything else. So it's much easier if we work from a black and white photocopy today. So as you can see, I've got my page of shading, page of shapes and line drawings. I have started some of the shading already. You need to think carefully about the type of shading that you're going to select to apply to the surface. It's very easy to suddenly find yourself adding texture. So for smooth, sheer surfaces where you get a slow graduation, something like this, something like cross-hatching, for instance, is not going to be appropriate. So we're looking at tonal shading. A good thing to do on a piece of scrap paper or the bottom of your page or the top of your page is just to practice a little bit of your shading. So I'm using a pinch grip, if you remember, pencil down, hand like a bird's beak, pick it up, and then so you're making contact with the page across this entire area, like that. That's obviously quite a wide area that I'm shading now, and it's no good for very fiddly and very sensitive areas, so you're better off just using the pencil like that. We talked about how to hold the pencil, quite relaxed, making sure the movement's going from here and here, not from your fingers like you were writing. We need to think about getting started. As I say, have a little practice first on a piece of paper. And you need, when you start shading, you need to think, I keep getting this piece of paper back out and forth, I'm just going to leave it there. You need to think about starting from the darkest areas. So for instance, I'm going to do this poppy seed head, which I've half started for the purposes of this video. So where are the darkest areas on here? If you are having difficulty identifying the darkest areas, then squint. What happens when you squint is that you allow less light into your eye and there's less information for your brain to process, and it has to make some decisions. So it will say, oh, well, this is light and that's dark. And by squint, what I mean is almost completely close your eyes, so you're seeing a very simplified version of what's in front of you. So not that we need to do it with this particular picture here, but if I almost completely close my eyes, it really stands out that these areas here are the darkest and down here. So I'm going to start with those areas here, and I'm going to use my pencil on its end, and I'm going to shade. Now, even within here, there is a variation in tone. So I'm going to start here and move my way out towards the edges of these little arches. Now, we did talk about last week, making sure that your drawing, it doesn't have to be perfect, and you mustn't get hung up on that. A lot of people give up at the first hurdle because it's not quite right. It just needs to look effective. This is about you learning the tools in order to express yourself rather than making a drawing that's identical to the original object or picture. As I said last week, If you want something that's identical, then take a picture. Nothing wrong with photography, it's a form of art, but it is different to drawing. Drawing is allowing the viewer, the person looking at the drawing, to see what you're seeing, see it the way you're seeing it. And that's what drawing is about. So yeah, there are some mistakes on here, and that doesn't really matter. That actually leads me quite convenient to the next point, that if you do find as you're shading, like just the tip of this area here isn't quite right, so I can just extend it as I'm shading round, and I'm going from the darkest areas through to the lightest, and I'm moving out from this central point here, and now the drawing's starting to take shape. And sometimes you find that on a photo things are very confusing. I mean, if you really want a challenge, then start drawing a pine cone. Pine cones are very mathematical and they're very highly patterned. And if you make a little bit of a mistake with the shading, you end up, the whole thing looks a bit wonky. So I'm just moving my way across, keep squinting. Any drawing should be 50% looking and 50% drawing. So it's a little bit, draw a bit, look, draw a bit, look, draw a bit, look. You shouldn't just, this is not a test. You're not supposed to be committing the original picture to memory and then draw the entire thing without looking at it again. Keep looking back and keep checking. So say I shade this entire area like this. And I'm scribbling at it a bit because I'm endeavouring to make a mistake. Like that. Go across here. And now, oh dear, it's eaten out. Oh, I'm thinking to myself, I wish I put a bit more variation in tone. Oh, I can't really take it back off now. Oh, but wait, you can take it off. You can use your rubber. And you can use your rubber to draw back into your shading. I did say keep it simple with what you're using. Simple smooth paper, simple rubber, pencil. However, these things are really useful. This is by Derwent, but you don't have to buy a Derwent brand. It's an electric rubber. It's got a button here. You press the button, the thing spins. You can get ones that vibrate as well, and you can draw back in. So you could shade if you have something a little fancy like that. I love my electric rubber. It's so useful because it's quite precise, and it's like drawing with, it's a bit like drawing with a pencil. It does use batteries. I can't recharge it. It doesn't seem to be too heavy on batteries though. I'm shading around there. Oh look, I've come outside the edges, so I'm going to get my rubber. I'm just going to in there. You do want, however, to put in some background. So that's not finished. I know it's not finished. We can make some, do a bit of shading there. We'll do texture next week because there is some texture on this drawing here, as you can see around here. But we will come to texture next week, so I can just use the same drawing and talk about texture. So I'm just going to put some shading in here. Try and keep it smooth. Try not to have scribbly marks and white gaps. That's why the practice is important. Scribbly marks and white gaps are a texture. So, and we want to keep it shaded at the moment. Okay, so I'm not going to put any of the little marks in on the stem or any of that. The hosta was quite a challenge because you've got light hitting. Obviously light comes from above because the sun is in the sky, and the light comes from above and it hits the leaf, and there's more shading underneath the leaf, so this leaf is overhanging and there's more shading underneath, therefore there's light on top. Okay, so far so simple, but then you've got these ridges, so you've got to work along this direction when you're shading. Now again, I know my drawing isn't identical and it doesn't need to be, but I started with the darkest areas and then worked my way across horizontally this time towards the lightest. And I'm rushing it a little bit because I'm aware that we're up against time if I'm to keep each video to around about 10 minutes. That's very awkward at this angle. Normally I'd just turn the sketchbook round. If you do want to turn a sketchbook around, there's nothing wrong with that. Do try and keep the thing you're drawing, though, at the same angle, which is why drawing from a picture is quite convenient, because if I want to turn my book, I can then turn my picture as well. turning things and looking at things from a different angle is a really useful way to check that it's reasonably accurate. So giving yourself a different view, looking at things upside down, turning the page, turning the drawing, having a look, looking at negative and positive space, all help to keep it a little bit more accurate. Right, so you do want a little bit of background. I have labelled this, but putting a bit of background on is good. I can use my clumsy pinch grip for that. And as soon as you start putting background on, what you start to notice is, oh, my drawing's disappearing. Maybe I should go over and see, now it looks so dark when you're putting on the shading here. It looks so dark, and as soon as you start to do your background, all of a sudden this looks much lighter. That's because it's obviously comparison. So all you need to do, take your pencil and just go back over it and make it a bit darker. This is where you're going to start when you've had a bit of practice with just an HB. This is where you're going to start wanting to use graduated pencils. Nothing very major to begin with. Maybe, you know, just an HB, a B and a 2B would be a good place to start.